All right, class, and now for our final supplemental video, we're going to talk about harmony, the last of the three elements of music that Judkin talks about in Chapter 2 of your textbook. Simply stated, harmony is the interaction of multiple musical pitches simultaneously, so in other words, being heard at the same time. In order to understand harmony, we should first talk about scales and how scales are constructed. So a scale is a collection of musical pitches from which melody and harmony are constructed. There are many types of these scales, and all of them sound different. And this is mainly due to the fact that each scale has a specific pattern of whole steps and half steps. So let's take this concept here and deal with our first scale, and we'll talk about a major scale. So again, scales have a pattern of whole steps and half steps. No matter what note you begin on the piano, you start with a note, and using this particular pattern, you can create a major scale. The pattern is whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. So let me show you this visually, and this will make much more sense because you'll also be able to hear it. So if I begin on the note C, and I use that formula that I just described to you, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Let's count up together. From C to D, that's your first whole step. D to E, that's your second whole step. E to F, this is a half step. Remember, this is that naturally occurring half step between the two groups of black keys. Between F and G, whole step, G, A, whole step, A, B, whole step, and B to C, half step. And that's the second naturally occurring half step here on the keyboard. So if I play this all together, it sounds like this. So there's your major scale. Just to illustrate how this can be done using any key, I'm going to start by going to another key. Let's start with the key of, let's just choose D right here. Now, a lot of times when you're constructing scales, you may have to use the black keys. And remember, the black keys are basically a way for us to sharp or flat or raise or lower certain notes in order to make them whole steps or half steps. So when we're making this scale, we sometimes have to call upon these black keys to, in order to basically plug this formula in. So let's start on D. D to E is our first whole step. Now, E to F is a half step. If we're making a major scale, we need to actually make this step a whole step. So instead of it being F natural, we're going to have to make it F sharp to make it a whole step. Now our next is going to be a half step from F to G. That's a half step. G to A, there's a whole step. A to B, whole step. Now we'll run into the same issues we did with E and F. This is a half step naturally. We have to make it a whole step, so we're going to sharp C, B to C, and then C sharp to D. That's our final half step. So a D major scale, using that same pattern, is... Again, that's just to illustrate that you can use that same pattern to create any major scale using that same pattern. Let's move on to our next scale called a minor scale. Now you probably were able to tell by me playing this major scale before that it has a very bright characteristic to it. It sounds cheerful and pleasant. Minor scales, on the other hand, have a darker, more pensive character to them. So you'll be able to definitely tell the difference between a major and a minor scale. I'll play them back to back here after we construct our first one. So just like our major scale, there is a pattern to how we construct a minor scale. Let's again go starting with the key of C. And using this pattern now, we can construct a minor scale. Whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step, whole step, whole step. Okay, so let's use that pattern and plug in a minor scale. First is a whole step, C to D. Next is a half step. Now remember, you can use black keys to change the quality of steps here. So we need a half step now, meaning we have to not go to E, that would be a whole step. Let's go to a black key, making it a half step, half the distance. Now we need to go up a whole step. This going to E would be a half step, so we're going to go up to F. There's our whole step. F to G, it's another whole step. We need another half step now. So instead of going to A natural, we're going to have to go to A flat. Now we'll need another whole step. This would be a half step normally, so we got to go to the next black key. And now we're going to go, finally, our last whole step. So a C minor scale sounds like this. Let me play a C major scale and then a C minor scale for you. Here's C major. Now C minor. You can definitely hear the difference in that scale. Much darker sounding than the major scale. Now that we've talked about major and minor scales, let's talk about some of the important notes in each scale. Your book talks about the first of these being the key note. Technically, the term for it is called the tonic note, and that is the note that you begin on, or the first note of any scale. So since we were using the example of C scales, our key note or our tonic of each of those scales would be C. Okay, so for instance, I played a C major scale, and before I played a C minor scale. We call scales by their key note or their tonic names. And that's simply indicating that when we play our scale, we begin on C and we end on C, an octave higher or an octave lower, depending on which direction we're going. Now, within that series of 8 notes, we also have a couple other important notes. Very, very important would be the 5th note of the scale. And this is any scale. It's not just the C major scale. No matter what key you're in, what scale you're using, the 5th note of that scale has a very, very important characteristic to it. It's gravitationally drawn back to the first note of the scale. And so whenever we hear the ending to a great symphony or a great concerto by a classical composer, we'll often hear something similar to a very final sounding punctuation mark. That 5th note of the scale has a very, very strong attraction back to the original note. Even more of an attraction is the 7th note of the scale, and that is called the leading tone. So if I play a C major scale and I were to stop on the 7th note of the scale, listen to how much tension is created by not resolving it and moving it back to the original tonic. Your ear wants it to go to there because this leading tone note is so full of energy and it's pulling so hard to the tonic that your ear just is begging for you to resolve it. There's a joke actually about Mozart, and who knows if this is actually true, but this joke says that one night while Mozart was sleeping, someone went to the piano and did that same thing, and Mozart woke up in his sleep and resolved the scale by going back to the tonic. It's kind of funny. But anyway, you get the idea. So the tonic note, very, very important. The 5th note, or the dominant note of that scale, also important. And the leading tone, so important. Lastly, I'd like to just show a couple more scales to you that your book discusses, and I would like you to hear them and also see them on the piano. First, let's talk about a pentatonic scale. Now, the prefix penta means 5. And so as you can imagine, a pentatonic scale means 5 tones or 5 notes. There are both major and minor pentatonic scales, and these scales, honestly, are in so much popular music. So let's start with the C major scale. Now we know that a major scale is made up of whole steps and half steps. If we wanted to turn this C major scale into a C pentatonic scale, we would have to pick 5 notes out from it, and we would have to get rid of 2 of them. So what we get rid of are the half steps that exist. And we know that in a C major scale, the half steps that occur are between the notes E and F and B and C. So if we get rid of the note F and we get rid of the note B, we will have a C major pentatonic scale. Very, very neutral sounding. I think that's the best word to describe a pentatonic scale. Very neutral. There are no half steps, so there's not a lot of tension. A lot of folk songs are actually composed of pentatonic scales for this reason. They're very singable, and they do not have any tension in them. You could do the same thing with a minor scale. Using the same idea of removing pitches from a scale, we can create a minor pentatonic. Let's start with a C minor scale. Now, when we're making a minor pentatonic scale, instead of getting rid of the half steps, we're getting rid of other tones in the scale. So you can take any minor scale and turn it into a pentatonic scale by getting rid of the second note, that would be D, and also getting rid of the 6th note, which in this case would be A flat. So if we do that, this is what we come up with. Used a lot in rock and roll and popular music. And then the last thing you could see here with this pentatonic idea is a blues scale. And many of you may have even picked up that a minor pentatonic scale sounds a lot like a blues scale. And that's because a blues scale is a minor pentatonic scale with 1 extra note. And that note is called a blue note. What you're doing to create this blue note is adding in an extra half step between the 3rd and 4th notes of the minor pentatonic scale. So in this case, let's just play a minor pentatonic scale starting on C. We have C, that's our first note, E flat, that's our second note, 3rd note is F, 4th note is G, and then our 5th note is B flat. And then we repeat back to C again. Now if we add a half step between the 3rd and 4th notes, these 2 notes, F and G, and we add that half step, that's this black key right here in between. So if we do that, we create a C blues scale. Pretty cool. And again, you could do that starting on any minor pentatonic scale. As long as you remember to add that blue note in there, all of a sudden you've created a blues scale. The last scale that I'll talk to you about here, I know that this is kind of a long explanation, but it's very important, is a chromatic scale. I showed you this earlier when we were talking about whole steps and half steps, but if you start on a particular note, let's say C, and a typical scale will go from C to C, if you play all of the half steps in between those 2 pitches, you get what's called a chromatic scale, and there are a total of 12 half steps. So if I go like this, there you have a chromatic scale. Okay, next we're going to talk about chords.